The Legacy Museum of African American History, in collaboration with Lynchburg Parks and Recreation Department, celebrates Juneteenth, the official commemoration of the emancipation of the last remaining enslaved African Americans in the Confederacy. This special edition of the Quincy Armstrong Show, written and directed by TERESA Harris, pays tribute to the accomplishments of African Americans after the Civil War. The show features Temika Young as Harriet Tubman, Russel Hill as Jackie Robinson, Janet Poles as Ketanji Brown Jackson, Charles Frederick as Edward Covey, and a special musical performance by Troy Jordan. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we present the Juneteenth edition of the Quincy Armstrong Show with guest host Troy Jordan. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Quincy Armstrong Show Juneteenth edition. My name is Troy Jordan, and I am guest hosting today's special episode commemorating the end of slavery. The occasion was bittersweet because it came 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863. It was June 19, 1865, when then Union soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas, and announced to the enslaved Texans that they were now free. Slave owners in Texas were well aware of the Emancipation Proclamation, but they ignored it. The economy of Texas was solidly based on the cotton production for which the plantation owners needed slave labor. When the Union soldiers, led by Major General Gordon Granger, arrived in Galveston, the announcement was simple but profound. It said, per General Order Number 3, the people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. Can you imagine the jubilation and subsequent fear that accompanied those words? Words that ignited a long and difficult journey to true freedom. A journey which to this day is still fraught with incredible victories and crushing setbacks. In honor of this momentous occasion, we have a diverse panel of individuals who have, in some form or fashion, been directly impacted by Juneteenth and the events that followed. All of you took advantage of the windows of opportunity that were made available to you by someone who either came before you or believed in your ability to achieve great success in your pursuit for better or worse. Tonight's guests are American abolitionist and political activist Harriet Tubman, plantation overseer Edward Covey, professional baseball player and the first African American to play in Major League Baseball, Jackie Robinson, and last but certainly not least, Associate Justice Designate of the Supreme Court of the United States, Ketanji Brown Jackson. Welcome, everyone. This should be a very lively and educational discussion. So let's get started. The first question is for each of you. You have all in some way changed the course of history. To varying degrees, all of you are trailblazers. So tell us, what was your most pivotal moment in your life? And when did you know that the struggle was greater than yourself? Why don't you start, Ms. Tubman?
Well, an overseer aiming at another slave hit me in the head with a heavy metal weight. Well, believe it or not, that hit to the head literally woke me up. After that injury, I began to have strange visions and very vivid dreams. I knew these visions were premonitions from God. Those premonitions helped guide me through some 13 missions to rescue enslaved friends, family members, and even strangers.
So how many people do you think you rescued?
Well, before the Civil War began, I rescued over 70 people using a network of anti-slave activists and slave holders.
So you're referring to what we now know as the Underground Railroad, right?
Indeed. And as the conductor, I didn't lose one passenger.
Well, what about your achievements after the Civil War began? What happened?
Let's just cut to the chase. I mean, we all know she was the first woman to lead an armed expedition and successfully liberated over 700 slaves in the raid of Covey Ferry. Big whoop.
Really? I mean, seriously. I am pleasantly surprised to see that you're up on your critical race theory, Mr. Covey. So since you seem to have a lot on your mind, why don't you just share with us your most pivotal moment? Oh, wait, hold it. But first, why don't you tell our audience what your responsibilities were as a plantation overseer?
Well, I was a first-rate overseer and Negro breaker. Slave owners from all over sent unruly slaves to me. It was my job to break them, break their spirit. And I must say, I was pretty good at it. Had I met you back then, Harriet, we might be having a totally different discussion today.
Yes, we would, because you would not be here.
Hey, I'm sorry. Please stay focused, Mr. Covey. What was your most pivotal moment?
Well, a plantation owner, Thomas Auld, had a very independent and headstrong young slave named Frederick Douglass. Now, Auld tried everything he could to break this slave's spirit. He tried to beat him, starve him into obedience. Nothing worked. So Auld sent him to me.
And what happened?
Well, I worked him. I worked him hard. It was never too hot, never too cold, never rained too hard, never snowed too heavy. If he was awake, he was working. After a few months, I broke him.
You broke Frederick Douglass.
That's what I said.
Oh, hold on. So let me make sure I understand this right. A broke, spirited Douglass was then sent back to the Auld plantation?
Well, one day I saw him passed out in the fields. For that, and I beat him mercilessly. But he escaped, ran back to the Auld plantation for protection. Now, Mr. Auld knew I wasn't done with him yet, so he sent him right back to me.
And then what happened?
Well, a slave had no say in his comings and goings. So when he was sent back, I was obligated to teach him a lesson.
So you broke him again? Like a wild horse?
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah, that's not what I heard.
Well, you see and hear imaginary things all the time.
I heard Douglass beat you into submission.
Never. He was Ald's property. Ald needed him out working in the fields, not dead.
Douglass said that the two of you fought and you gave up.
Well, who are you going to believe? Me or a slave?
A slave.
Well, you realize I could have killed Douglass for hitting me, and it would have been perfectly legal.
Yeah, but how would that have looked?
That's right. The rumor mill would have gone something like this. The great Negro breaker, Edward Covey, had to kill a slave because he couldn't break him.
That's right.
Your reputation as a slave breaker would have been in ruins. And you didn't want that. So you let it go. Not counting on Douglas' ability to later write a critically acclaimed book about his encounter with you.
You know, Lincoln didn't really care if you people were slaves or not.
So now you want to talk about Lincoln.
Well, ain't that why we're here? To talk about the Emancipation Proclamation?
No. We are not here to talk about that. We are here to talk about Juneteenth and its impact, enduring impact.
So let me just tell you, regardless of Lincoln's feelings about slavery, the 13th Amendment was passed by the Senate on April 8, 1864, by the House of Representatives on January 31st, 1865, ratified by the required 27 of the then 36 states on December 6, 1865, and proclaimed as law on December 18, 1865. Slavery had been abolished.
Yes, it was.
It was the first of the 3 Reconstruction Amendments adopted following the Civil War.
So what, are you one of them high sedity lawyers?
I am better than that.
All right.
I am the hope and the dream of the slave.
Yeah.
And your worst nightmare.
All right now, come on now. All right now, y'all. So, Jackie, tell us about your pivotal moment in life.
I will be glad to. But first, let me provide a little historical context. As you know, after the Civil War ended, there was a brief period of time from about 1865 to 1867 where federal laws offered noticeable protection of civil rights for former slaves and free blacks.
During that time, the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution was adopted on July 9, 1868, as the second of the 3 Reconstruction Amendments. Wow. Often considered as one of the most consequential amendments, it addresses citizenship rights and equal protection under the law, and was proposed in response to issues related to former slaves following the Civil War.
And now, black men were now able to vote.
Now, let me just also tell you, the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits the federal government and each state from denying or abridging a citizen's right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It was ratified on February 3rd, 1870, as the third and last of the Reconstruction Amendments. Now, unfortunately, this amendment only applied to men. Women, black and white, would have to wait a little longer to gain their voting right.
See, give y'all a bit of learning and you get all uppity.
As a result of this, black men ran for and won positions in local and state government. Blacks at least actually had a voice. However, as the economy of the South continued to decline due to the lack of free labor, black voter suppression and intimidation began to rear its ugly head in very violent ways.
Now, it should be noted that during this time, Democrats took over power in Southern legislatures and began passing more restrictive voter registration electoral laws, as well as passing legislation to segregate blacks and whites.
It is also important to remember that the Democratic and Republican parties of the late 1800s were very different parties than what exists today.
Yeah.
You can say that again. Back then, the Democratic Party saw things were going in the wrong direction and they were just trying to right this ship. I mean, they wanted to restore the South back to the way it was once before the war. Things were pretty good up till then.
Pretty good for who?
Zaya.
Well, the Southern legislature was controlled by the Democratic Party, who enacted state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in the Southern states. They were called Jim Crow laws, and those laws were enforced until 1965.
I don't see the problem. I mean, the law clearly states that even though the facilities were separate, they were equal. You people aren't happy with anything.
Well, Jim Crow laws were contested, but they were upheld in 1896 in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the U.S. Supreme Court laid out its separate but equal legal doctrine for facilities for African Americans. Public education had already been segregated since the end of the war.
Exactly. As I said, separate but equal. It was clearly written in the law.
Although in theory, the equal segregation doctrine was extended to public facilities and transportation too, you have to know that facilities for African Americans were consistently inferior and underfunded compared to facilities for white Americans. Sometimes there were no facilities for the black community at all. Facilities were separate, but definitely not equal, if they existed at all.
Well, it was better than the slave cabins.
You got one more time.
Well, just,
Looks like she might need some anger management.
Come on, man. Ignore him. Listen, states outside the South also were affected by formal and informal policies of segregation, right?
true, but many states outside the South had adopted laws beginning in the late 19th century that in a variety of ways banned discrimination in public accommodation and voting. But believe me, there were subtle and not so subtle forms of racial discrimination.
And Jackie, I am sure you experienced firsthand a lot of those subtle and not so subtle forms of discrimination.
Oh, yes, I did.
So it's safe to say that at a time that when you entered the major leagues, baseball was a pretty segregated sport.
Well, sadly it was. Earlier in my life, I had been bolstered by the belief that sports was the one area that the way you were treated wasn't based on the color of your skin, but by your ability.
Yeah.
And of course, I later found out that not be true.
So how were you able to successfully break the color barriers in Major League Baseball?
It's probably not what you think. I was approached by Branch Rickey, president and club owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, who chose me not as much for my athleticism, but for my ability to ignore the racism that he knew would come my way.
So you pretty much went along to get along.
Well, that seemed at the time to be the most expedient way to get where I needed to be. And I left the door open for so many others. There is more than one way to accomplish your goal.
That's right, exactly. So regardless of how you ended up there, you were the first African American to play in Major League Baseball, and you had quite an amazing career. You paid the dues and paved the way for many others.
I'd like to think that myself and some of the other earlier players, such as Larry Doby, Willard Brown, Roy Campanella, and Satchel Paige, made a difference.
Trust me, you did too, both on and off the field. It is so impressive to me that your use of nonviolence and your talent challenged the practices of segregation that were so pervasive in American life. You influenced the culture and contributed significantly to the civil rights movement. You also were the first black television analyst in Major League Baseball and the first black vice president of major corporation. And in 1960, you helped establish the Freedom National Bank, an African-American owned financial institution based in Harlem, New York. I would say you definitely made a difference.
Yeah.
And your shoulders should be pretty sore from the weight of those who stood on them.
Yes, yes.
And speaking of making a difference, Miss Ketanji Brown Jackson, Associate Justice Designate of the Supreme Court of the United States, whom, upon being sworn in, will be the first, I'll say it again, will be the first black woman to sit on the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
This to me feels like a yes we can moment.
Yes.
And I think I speak for most people in this country in saying we are so very, very proud of you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jordan.
Now, I imagine every milestone in your life has been a pivotal moment. So I'm going to ask you a different question. Okay. I must say that during your confirmation hearing, you handled yourself admirably and with the utmost restraint. And as a black woman who on average has to work twice as hard and be 3 times better than your white counterparts, what would you say to young black women who look up to you as a role model and leader?
I would say never let anyone else define you or discourage you. Be confident in your abilities and be resilient in the face of obstacles.
Well, that is some great advice. But how does one develop that confidence and resilience, especially in an environment that discourages it at every turn?
I believe that a good education is the foundation for everything else in life. I went to a very good public school in South Miami where I got involved in student government and was elected president of a very large student body of 800. But my primary extracurricular activity was speech and debate, or as some call it, forensics. I can say without hesitation that this particular activity best prepared me for future success in law and in life.
Well, how so?
Well, forensics taught me how to reason and how to write. Public speaking helped me to gain the self-confidence that can often be quite difficult for women and minorities to develop at an early age. My high school experience as a competitive speaker taught me to not be deterred by obstacles, to stand firm in the face of challenges, and to work hard, to be resilient, to strive for excellence, and to believe that anything is possible.
All right. Well said. Well said.
That's what I'm talking about.
That's right.
Mrs. Tubman, you have always been a huge inspiration to me.
And Miss Jackson, besides Miss Tubman, who else inspired you?
Well, I was very much inspired by the women of the suffragette movement.
Really? Well, audience, did you know some historians refer to the 30 years between 1890 and 1920 as the women's era? Because in that time, women started to have greater economic and political opportunities and, to some degree, greater power as consumers.
And during that time, there were prominent women such as Susan B. Anthony.
Yeah, I worked alongside Susan B. Anthony.
Oh, all right now.
And she was a formidable ally.
All right.
I bet she was. Ida B. Wells and Anna Julia Cooper also emerged as fervent advocates of the suffragette movement. Public tactics of the movement included parades, silent vigils, and hunger strikes. Although white women and black women were fighting for the same privileges, black women were figuratively and literally relegated to the back of the line when it came to the public fight for women's voting rights.
Wow.
I read somewhere that Ida B. Wells defied the back of the line policy and joined her white state delegates at the front of the line.
Well, that sounds like Ida. And even though our objectives were the same, race was still a powerfully divisive factor within the women's movement.
Yes, it was. However, on August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment became law. The amendment guaranteed American women the right to vote, at least at the federal level.
Wow. I admit, something that I didn't even know until recently was that 3 local black women were among the first women to vote in Lynchburg.
Now, remember that the 19th Amendment was not ratified in Virginia until 1952.
Oh, well, that's true, very true. But that didn't stop Luigi Ferguson and Virginia Cabell Randolph and Lucy Bolden Stevens from voting in the 1920 presidential election between Warren Harding and James Cox.
Wow. Those women were pretty progressive back then.
Indeed, they were.
Now, as you mentioned earlier, Mr. Jordan, the journey to true freedom has been bittersweet, filled with victories and setbacks, yet still inching forward.
Inching forward is right. It wasn't until 1965 before all African Americans were granted this right to vote.
Yes, but in 1965, the Voting Rights Act passed, granting African Americans full voting rights. However, exclusions for language minorities still exist.
Yeah, the fight to freedom is an ongoing struggle.
Yes, it is.
We must remain ever vigilant.
Yes, we should. Yes, we should.
That's right. Don't get complacent. There'll always be some of us fighting to return the Confederacy to its rightful place in this country.
Unfortunately, he's right. Voter suppression and other societal ills are alive and well.
But so is the dream.
Yes.
Need I say more? I want to thank our panelists, and audience, I want to thank you. This is Troy Jordan, and we'll see you next time on the Quincy Armstrong Show. Before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to be with God and be free. No more weeping, no more weeping, and no more weeping over me. And be freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to be with God and be free. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to be with God and be free.